Hi, students. This is an image of the brain, the human brain, and I want to think of the human brain as three separate brains that evolved on top of each other, kind of like a Russian doll, a doll within a doll within a doll. There's a brain within a brain within a brain. So we're going to start with the simplest form of the brain. We're going to call this the brain stem. The brain stem also can be called the lizard brain or the reptile brain. This part here we're looking at is the brain stem, and then here as well, this part at the edge is the cerebellum. This collectively is the most primitive brain form that we share in common with reptiles, which are some of the oldest land-dwelling creatures. And the reptile brain is responsible for the autonomic functions of the brain. So this is connected to breathing, blinking, your heartbeat. All of those functions you can't afford to have to consciously be in charge of, because, well, when you fall asleep, if you had to be, you would not be able to continue to have your heart beat. The fact that your heart can beat even when you're asleep is because the nerves that are connected to the brain, that go from the heart to the brain and back, is connected to the brain stem. So when we think of the brain stem, I want you to think about autonomic functions. And a more recently evolved brain, let's say 200 million years or more, is the evolution of this brain stem. Then, like, I don't know, 60 million years ago, give or take, we have this emotional system we call the mammalian brain. And this is going to be part of the brain that is associated with communication, feelings, emotional processing. This is part of that. This is the part of the brain that allows us to communicate and share feelings and laugh, cry. All of those emotional responses to the world are associated with this part of the brain. And then the more recently evolved part of the brain would be this frontal lobe, or the neocortex, I should say, meaning the new brain. And that is more associated, more recently developed, several million years old. And that is associated with planning, judgment, abstract reasoning. So things like writing, math, all of those types of functions, those abilities are the result of an evolved frontal lobe. When we talk about the lobes of the brain, I want you to think about these main lobes. We talk about the occipital lobe at the back of the brain. So imagine there's your eyes here. There's an optic nerve that connects from the eye to the back of the brain. And so when you see something, electrical impulses travel along the optic nerve and they reach the occipital lobe, and that interprets what you see. So you're right now looking at me and you're interpreting me. Your brain is interpreting that as such. And the temporal lobe is associated with hearing, communication, emotions, and memory. So right now, you are understanding the words that I'm saying because you understand English, and the information is translating into meaningful content for you. If you didn't understand English, then your temporal lobe would still be working, but it would not be interpreting or translating it into something that is usable for you. This part of the brain is strongly associated with memory, which is also why we tend to remember things that we love and hate, because our brain really solidifies memories associated with feelings. Our brain is fundamentally a feeling mechanism that is able to think logically. The logical part of our brain is the least developed and takes the longest for it to develop. Now, the parietal lobe is most commonly associated with complex skills, complex motor skills, things that involve your hands. So when you learn how to write, draw, knit, any kind of really complex skill, you are engaging your parietal lobe. You are engaging all of your brain, but there's a greater amount of resources being engaged in the parietal lobe when you are engaged in those types of complex skills, those fine motor control skills. Then finally, we have the frontal lobe. The frontal lobe is associated with the planning, abstract reasoning, thinking about the future. Again, other animals have this, they just don't have it as large or as thick. This is sort of the largest part of the human brain. And all of this is necessary, but I would say that this is the part that distinguishes humans from other animals. If we look at the goat's frontal lobe is really, really small. The temporal lobe is much larger part of their brain. So they interpret the world in concrete images much more than they interpret it in terms of abstract reasoning and thought. As far as I'm aware, they don't have the same kind of, I'm sure they recognize each other and they have feelings, things like that, but making plans for the future is probably not part of the way their brain operates. Although for some animals it is, so squirrels storing nuts or acorns for the winter, there is some kind of future planning that is happening there. So again, the brain in and of itself is basically trapped in the skull, and it only is able to communicate with the outside world through the nerve endings that connect to the brain. So the brain is the central control of this homeostasis, of the entire homeostasis, and it needs the nerves in order to get information about what's going on. So the optic nerve allows the brain to receive visual stimuli and say, okay, you're looking at something, it's safe, it's not safe. Your auditory nerves allow you to hear information and say, okay, this is good, this is bad. And then your vagus nerve is a nerve that connects your brain to all of your major organs. So your brain has a nerve that goes to your heart and lungs, and then down to the stomach and the liver. So this is essentially this nerve pathway is sending information to the brain to let it know that these parts of the body are operating correctly. So when you're hungry, an electrical impulse travels from your stomach up to your brain to let you know, okay, I have not eaten in a while. This pathway is part of what allows your body and brain to coordinate to maintain collective homeostasis throughout the entire body.